Hello, and thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. It's a real honour to be able to address you and an absolute pleasure. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Quality and safety, what a fantastic opportunity to speak to it. And I have been in the midst and the hurly-burly of many issues around quality and safety through the last 2.5, 3 years. No surprise that I'll focus on COVID-19, but I would like to particularly focus on one aspect, and I think it lies at the heart of quality and safety issues, and that's the issue of COVID-19 transmission. And the big question of droplet transmission, fomite transmission, airborne transmission. It sounds reasonably straightforward. It was hugely controversial, remains controversial in some ways, but was hugely controversial through 2020, 2021 in particular. I think Victoria was a little bit at the heart of that with respect to that issue in Australia. But it played out around the world in fascinating ways, and I think ways that have lessons for me personally, and I think would have and should have lessons for anyone who's focused on quality and safety in healthcare settings. In a sense, it's not controversial. We've just had, through Nature, the journal, a consensus statement, 363 or thereabouts, experts on a panel chiming in, multiple authors, and a really robust Delphi process to come to very strong consensus recommendations, really for the entirety of pandemic control measures and responses. But one of the interesting features is that COVID-19 transmission, the issue of airborne transmission and of increased risk in poorly ventilated indoor settings had 100% consensus, either strong agreement or agreement that COVID-19 was transmitted through an airborne route and was significantly increased in poorly ventilated indoor spaces. That sounds straightforward to me now, to us now maybe, but back in the day, that was not the case. It was certainly our challenge in the beginning of the pandemic that we didn't know all of the science. We didn't know what was going on, and there was emerging epidemiology, there was emerging case studies, and there was emergent multidisciplinary views on COVID-19 transmission. And in lots of ways, there was a bit of caution about jumping to conclusions, as there should be. We should take a relatively conservative approach in terms of the evidence base as it's beginning to be built. By the same token, we shouldn't jump to really definitive conclusions in the negative. And that was kind of problematic. It was problematic in March, April 2020, when WHO came out with a pretty definitive statement that COVID-19 was not airborne, despite the fact that there was growing evidence of transmission beyond that magical 1.5 metre range, and multiple disciplines going to WHO with, albeit emergent evidence and sometimes weak evidence, that it could be otherwise. So I think the issue is not so much that we didn't go to a definitive conclusion about COVID-19 being airborne. It's that we didn't globally, and including in Australia, in the early phase of the pandemic, speak to that uncertainty and communicate an open-mindedness about the possibilities. We were too definitive. I don't know if it was marked by the fact that we had a limited PPE supply, mask supply, both for healthcare workers and for the community in Australia and indeed globally, as demand was extraordinary. But that shouldn't have been a determinant of how we reviewed evidence and how we communicated that evidence, or whether it was, as has been reported in New York Times and elsewhere, the challenge of overturning historical inertia of 100 plus years, the so-called orthodoxy of transmission. And orthodoxy is not a bad thing. Orthodoxy speaks to wisdom of the ages, the accumulated wisdom of many, many, many years. But ortho, meaning straight, can lead you on a path that doesn't have the adaptability, the agility to move in new directions as required by the evidence before you or by the challenges before you. And I think that was a significant failure. I know the, who was it? Alberta Nursing AGM called out the failure to recognise airborne transmission as an egregious failure of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not sure it was the most egregious by any means, because there were issues of vaccine inequity that were much more significant, of the failure to deliver oxygen canisters around the world, the vaccine inequity both within countries and between countries. They were huge issues. But it was an issue of quality and safety, and it was an issue for healthcare workers around the world. So I think it's an important one to reflect upon. As I say, there was an orthodoxy that really held momentum beyond the time that it should have, and closed down a number of commentators and significant expert and influential global bodies, US CDC, WHO, and even our own ACHS, to explore a more nuanced approach and to communicate a greater nuance around the possibility of airborne transmission. And the evidence came from different areas, and I think it should have been spoken to at a much earlier time. I'm proud that Victoria came to a point, probably in June of 2020, where we were effectively acknowledging airborne transmission. That happened when N95 masks were used in aged care and hospital settings, but also where the masking for the community messaging was particularly strong. That was my view, again, formed without an absolute certainty about its effectiveness or the robustness of evidence, but taking the precautionary principle that there was very likely to be minimal harms against the very substantial possibilities of benefits that community masking and masking in those healthcare settings at a higher level than the standards that had been set previously, the surgical masks, should be instituted in Victoria. I think that was really important as, 1 in 3 infected individuals in aged care died of COVID at a time when we had no vaccines and no treatment, and at a time when hospital staff were significantly at greater risk of becoming infected than in the general community. That's a recognition of the transmission that was occurring despite the PPE standards that were in place at that time. There was, of course, debate around whether those healthcare workers picked it up outside of work or in work, but that was really answered over the subsequent months, where it was essentially shown that healthcare settings were a place of transmission that put healthcare workers at greater risk because patients had COVID-19, they were presenting with COVID-19. So it was a really important issue from a quality and safety perspective. That's it from me. I hope you have a wonderful awards night. I hope the safest and most quality-driven individual wins on the night. But please enjoy. I hope the background, I was told I should have a decent background. I hope the background's been okay. It's my world map, which I was meant to flag the 90-odd countries I've travelled to over the last 30 years, but have failed to do so yet. It's been a busy couple of years. I did have an alternative background here, but I thought that's possibly not for a professional gathering such as yours. But please have a wonderful time, and thanks again so much for the opportunity to speak today.